Hello learners, I'm Ipshita Sashmal, Assistant Professor, Ambedkar University, Delhi. Today we are going to talk about assessing listening, tools and strategies. First, let us discuss why we need to assess listening. As teachers, we must assess our learners through multiple modalities like listening and speaking, as well as reading and writing. Assessing of listening is often ignored in traditional classrooms. Why do you think that is the case? Listening often is difficult to assess because of the large class size that we find in Indian classrooms. Also, sometimes it is difficult to play an audio recording in a large classroom. These are some of the reasons why listening is sometimes not assessed at all. In today's talk, we are going to look at some of the strategies and tools in which teachers can assess listening in the classroom. Let us first look at the aspects of listening that need to be assessed. These are also sometimes called macro strategies. These are some strategies that learners often use in the classroom when they are listening to their teachers, making notes, and also when they are listening to a video or a talk. These are the 6 macro strategies of listening which need to be assessed in the classroom. Predicting. When learners are predicting, they have to guess the meaning of something before the person speaks it. For this, learners have to activate their background knowledge and the context. Monitoring is the next macro strategy that learners often use in the classroom. In monitoring, the learners have to check whether what they have listened to or understood is correct. In responding, learners have to relate the listening content to one's knowledge and experience of the world. When learners listen, sometimes in an interaction, they also have to respond verbally. This is called interactive listening. It is important that learners clarify meanings. When they have not understood something, they have to check their understanding and whether it is correct. Next macro strategy is inferencing or guessing the implied meanings. Sometimes in academic texts or lectures or talks, there are some meanings which are implied but not directly stated. In such cases, the learner has to understand the implied meanings of the listening text. Finally, we have the 6th macro strategy, which is evaluating. Evaluating can work at 2 levels. The learner sometimes has to check how well the listening content has been understood. For this, the learner asks certain questions to himself or herself, like, have I understood this correctly? On the other hand, evaluating can also happen at the level of the text. The learner sometimes has to evaluate the content of the text and try and understand its validity. The learner can, in such situations, question the content of the listening text. These are the 6 macro strategies of listening. Now we are going to look at some of the listening skills that correspond with each of these macro strategies. The listening skills can also be called the micro skills, which the learners use while using the macro strategy. The first macro strategy is predicting. When learners listen to something, they need to use various skills to understand the content. In such situations, they have to identify the signposts and the link markers. In every listening text, just like in a written text, there are signposts and link markers. These words or phrases signal to the listener what is going to come next. As a good listener, the learner must identify these words to be able to understand the relationship between the ideas and the concepts that are being explained. The next skill we are going to discuss is called hedging. Hedging is using of language to indicate different degrees of uncertainty. For example, speakers often use words such as seem, appear to be, indicate, may, might, could, would, sometimes, assume, and so on. These words indicate that the speaker is uncertain about the concept or the idea that they're talking about. A good listener has to understand the use of such hedging language. The next macro strategy is monitoring. Learners use skills such as identifying markers of quotations or direct speech, identifying different meanings of lexical items, identifying markers of conclusion, and so on, when they are using the micro strategy of monitoring. The next micro strategy is responding. When a learner is responding to a listening text, he or she has to look at the importance markers in a listening text. The learner also has to identify the definitions and explanations in the listening content. Many a times, learners have to cope with fast speech. There are different kinds of speakers, and hence the pace of speech also varies accordingly. A good listener must listen to fast speech and also learn to cope with it and understand the content. The next macro strategy is clarifying. It is important for listeners to understand the expressions of contrast. When speakers use words such as but, however, it indicates that there is a contrast between two ideas. In such situations, the listener must comprehend the logical relationship between the ideas being talked about. When learners have to clarify their meaning and they have to clarify something that they did not understand, they also need to use polite language. It is important for the listener to understand where to use polite language to clarify a meaning in an interaction. We are now going to look at the macro strategy inferencing. When learners recognize word and sentence level stress, they are able to better understand or infer the meaning of the listening text. Sometimes information in a speech or a talk is recycled. This means that the same information is stated in different ways. A good listener is able to exploit this strategy and is able to check his or her understanding of the text. The next strategy we are going to discuss is evaluating. Learners sometimes have to use reading input. They read something and they also listen to their teacher in the classroom, or they listen to a talk or a video. In such cases, the learners have to connect the information, the two sources of information. Identifying positive and negative arguments are also part of using the macro strategy of evaluating. A good listener is able to identify which arguments are positive and which are negative in nature. Recognizing word stress is also an important skill which helps a learner to evaluate the listening content. Teachers need to use these macro strategies and the listening skills to assess their learners in the content subjects and also in their language classrooms. Now we are going to look at understanding the links between listening and speaking. When a learner listens to something, it automatically means that there has been a speaker who has been speaking something. Hence, listening and speaking are closely related. It is important for the learner to understand the links between listening and speaking. Let us look at how speaking and listening are related. When a speaker speaks fast or slow, that is, the pace of the speaker is fast or slow, the listener has to understand the fast or slow speech. Also, when a speaker is speaking loudly or softly, it is important to understand loud or soft speech. Similarly, there are some speakers who speak more and there are some who speak less. It is important for a good listener to understand the content from less or more speech. Some speakers have clear pronunciation, others don't. It is important for a listener or a learner to understand the pronunciation of the speaker. Different speakers use different kinds of words in their speech. A good listener has to understand the meaning of a range of words that the speaker has been talking about. There could sometimes be hesitations, repetitions, backtracking, and pauses in the speech. It is important to comprehend the content despite hesitations, repetitions, and backtracking. So we have now looked at the links between listening and speaking. When we are assessing listening, we must check whether our learners are able to understand texts that are fast or slow. where the speaker is speaking loudly and or softly, where the speaker speaks little or where a speaker actually speaks quite a lot to explain a concept. So these are certain kinds of listening texts that we can choose when we are assessing listening. We move on to assessing perception skills. When there is a listening text, it is important for the learners to recognize individual words. What do we mean by that? In listening, the learner has to comprehend the text at two levels. One level is the level of the sounds which combine to form words, words that combine to form sentences, and sentences that combine to form a longer text. It is important for learners to recognize individual words as well as discriminate between sounds. If a learner, for example, is not able to distinguish between two sounds, sh and s, the learner will not be able to comprehend a text that has both of these sounds. Learners also need to identify reduced forms in fast speech. This is called elision and assimilation. A good listener has to identify such reduced forms in fast speech. It is important for listeners to understand stressed syllables in English. For example, let us take the word present. When the first syllable of this word is stressed, present, it is a noun. However, if the second syllable of this word is stressed, it becomes a verb, present. Listeners need to identify and know the difference between stressed syllables. It is also important for listeners to identify stressed words in syllables. It is essential to identify stressed words in utterances as well. In a sentence, sometimes it is important to stress on a certain word to indicate a certain meaning. Finally, learners need to identify and recognize intonation patterns. Now we move on to using knowledge of the world. When a listener is listening to a text, he or she needs to use his or her knowledge of the world. It is important to connect groups of words to non-linguistic features such as expressions, gestures, or objects in order to get clues to meaning. So when we use a lecture, a video, or a talk where the learners can see the speakers, that is a better text to use for assessment of listening. Using knowledge of a topic to guess what the speaker might be saying about it is another essential skill about using knowledge of the world. Using knowledge about the patterns that certain oral interactions typically take in order to predict what is being said is also very essential. For example, instructions, making a telephone call. In this example, a learner needs to know the patterns of communication that are prevalent in such a context. When the learner listens to a text which has a similar context, it is easier for him or her to identify the patterns in the interaction. Finally, learners also need to use background knowledge to understand the context of the listening text. We move on to discussing dealing with information. It is important for learners to understand the gist or the meaning and the overall idea of the listening text. Learners have to identify the main points of a text. They need to be able to comprehend the details and the examples in a text that they are listening to. Sometimes they also have to infer information which is not directly or explicitly stated or which has been missed. All of these situations need to be assessed through listening texts that we choose for assessment. When we are assessing learners on their listening abilities, it is important to choose texts which have real-life situations. Even in the classroom, the learners have to listen to interactions between speakers. These could be their friends or classmates. The interaction could be between the teacher and a certain student or between teachers. These are some real-life situations where listeners have to listen to something and understand the meaning. It is also important to understand the interaction between two or more speakers. This is an essential listening skill which needs to be assessed. Let us now look at some of the aspects of interactive listening where two or more speakers are involved. In such a situation, the listener has to cope with variations among speakers. For example, differences in speed of talking and accent. The listener also has to recognize the speaker's intention. It is important to identify the speaker's mood or his or her attitude. We can also use the speaker's cues about things such as when to take a turn or when there is a change of topic. When a listener is listening to a text, he or she should be able to identify such cues. Finally, it is important to test whether our learners are able to predict what the speaker will say next. This means that the tasks of assessment that teachers are going to prepare to assess listening needs to focus on all of these different aspects of understanding the interaction between two or more speakers. We are now going to look at some listening tasks which can be used for assessment. It is always a good idea to use authentic materials for assessing listening, such as lectures. Students are used to lectures in the classroom. They listen to their teachers and they take notes. This task can be used even for assessing listening in an assessment context. A learner can be given a lecture and can be asked to take notes. Clips from radio, television can be used to assess listening. Tasks such as information gap and multiple choice answers can be used to assess the listening skills of the learners. Sometimes audiobooks can be used to assess listening. In this case, comprehension questions can be used as tasks to test listening. Announcements and social interaction from everyday life can also be used to assess listening. In both of these situations, information gap activities or multiple choice questions can be tasks which can be used for assessment. Telephone conversations are often used as listening text in assessment contexts. In such cases as well, information gap and multiple choice questions are good task types. Videos can be played for the students and they can be asked to make notes. They can also be given some information gap activities and multiple choice questions. Using all of these different kinds of tasks and different kinds of authentic materials, the teacher can easily assess listening in the classroom. Sometimes the teacher might not have certain devices to play a text in the classroom. In such a situation, the teacher can very easily read out the listening text in the classroom and give certain questions to the learners which they need to answer. This is a very easy method of assessing listening in large classrooms. I hope this talk on listening tasks and assessments would be useful for all of you. Thank you.